Before we get to the witch trials themselves, we need to spend time inside the world that produced them. Because almost every fact about Salem 1692 sounds unreal until you understand the world it came from. And the world it came from was itself almost unreal. A Puritan colony on the edge of a wilderness, convinced it was in a cosmic battle with the devil, running without a valid government, surrounded by enemies, and eating grain that may have been trying to kill it. Let's start there. Fact 1. Nobody in 1692 knew they lived next to a volcanic-level fault in their own legal system. Massachusetts in 1692 had no valid royal charter. The original Puritan charter had been revoked in 1684. The Dominion of New England, the despised administrative arrangement that merged the colonies under a royal governor, had collapsed in 1689 during England's Glorious Revolution. The new charter arrived with Governor Phipps in May 1692, right as the crisis was exploding. This means that the Court of Oyer and Terminer, which sent 19 people to the gallows, was established under an untested legal framework by a governor who had held the job for weeks. Every execution was carried out by a court operating on uncertain legal ground that nobody had tested. When critics later challenged the court's authority, the legal answer was genuinely unclear. Fact 2. The accused could not pray in court, and that itself was used as evidence of guilt. During the court examinations, if an accused person attempted to recite the Lord's Prayer, a standard test of Christian faith, and stumbled even slightly over the words, the court treated the stumble as evidence of guilt. The logic: the devil prevents his servants from correctly reciting sacred text. This sounds absurd until you realize that standing before a packed courtroom full of screaming, convulsing accusers, with your life on the line, would cause almost anyone to stumble over words they had recited 1,000 times. The test was, by design, almost impossible to pass under the conditions in which it was administered. Several of the condemned failed the prayer test. Their failure became part of the trial record against them. Fact 3. The witch hunt spread fastest to a town that had nothing to do with where it started. Salem Village is where everyone thinks of when they hear Salem Witch Trials. But the town that produced the most accusations was not Salem Village. It was Andover, Massachusetts, a community 10 miles to the north that had no particular history of witchcraft accusations before 1692. When 2 of the Salem Village afflicted girls were brought to Andover to identify witches by touch, they triggered an outbreak of accusations that ultimately surpassed Salem Village in total numbers. Andover produced more than 50 accused witches. The pattern suggests that the trigger was not something specific to Salem Village. It was a mechanism of accusation that could be transplanted to any community and would then run on local social fuel. Fact 4. The afflictions followed social networks, not geography. One of the most telling features of the Salem crisis is the map of who got afflicted and who got accused. When researchers overlaid the accusation records onto the property maps and church membership rolls of Salem Village, what emerged was not a random distribution. The afflicted and their supporters tended to live on one side of the village, the western, more rural, more economically marginal side. The accused tended to live on the other side, closer to Salem town, more commercially connected, more prosperous. This east-west split in the accusations corresponded precisely to a pre-existing community dispute about whether Salem Village should have an independent church. The witch hunt ran directly along the fault lines of a land dispute that had been simmering for a decade before anyone mentioned witchcraft. Fact 5. The rye crop may have been producing hallucinations before anyone accused anyone. The ergot hypothesis, the idea that the afflicted girls were experiencing genuine hallucinations caused by ergot-contaminated rye grain, has never been definitively proved or disproved, and the debate continues among historians and scientists. What is documented is this. The winter of 1691-1692 was exceptionally wet in eastern Massachusetts, creating precisely the conditions under which Claviceps purpurea, the ergot fungus, thrives on rye. The geographic distribution of afflictions in Salem Village corresponds roughly to the areas where rye cultivation was most common. The symptoms described, convulsions, visions, sensations of burning, the feeling of being bitten or pinched by invisible forces, match the documented symptom profile of convulsive ergotism. Whether ergot was the cause, a contributing factor, or a coincidence remains genuinely unknown. Fact 6. Cotton Mather personally witnessed an execution and wrote about it approvingly, then spent the rest of his life defending himself. Cotton Mather, the most prominent young minister in Massachusetts in 1692, attended the execution of Reverend George Burroughs on August 19, 1692. Burroughs was a Harvard-educated minister and former pastor of Salem Village, who had been convicted of being the ringleader of all the witches in Massachusetts. At the gallows, Burroughs recited the Lord's Prayer perfectly, an act that caused a visible stir in the crowd, since the belief was that witches couldn't do this. The crowd began to murmur about innocence. Mather intervened from horseback, reminding the crowd that the court had found Burroughs guilty by due process, and the execution proceeded. Mather spent decades afterward being attacked for this moment. His reputation never fully recovered, even in his own time. Fact 7. The political chaos of 1692 created a justice vacuum that the witch trials filled. In the spring of 1692, Massachusetts had no functioning judiciary. The old courts had dissolved with the old charter. The new courts hadn't been established yet. Jails were filling with accused witches, but there were literally no legal structures to try them. Governor Phipps established the Court of Oyer and Terminer as an emergency measure, an ad hoc tribunal created specifically for the witchcraft crisis. It was not a regular court. It had no clear precedent for its procedures. It was staffed by men who were administrators and merchants, not trained jurists. The result was a court that made up its rules as it went, and made them in ways that made conviction essentially inevitable. Fact 8. King William's War created a generation of trauma that went directly into the courtroom. The people of Salem Village in 1692 were not living in peaceful isolation. King William's War, the North American theater of a European conflict, had been producing horrific frontier raids by French forces and their Native American allies since 1689. Several key figures in the Salem crisis were refugees from destroyed Maine communities, survivors of massacres who had walked south through winter carrying their dead and their post-traumatic stress. The Puritan theological framework interpreted these raids as evidence of God's displeasure and the devil's active operation in New England. When afflictions began in Salem Village, they landed in a community already primed by years of terror to believe that supernatural forces were attacking them from multiple directions simultaneously. Fact 9. The very first accused person was Tituba, and her confession changed everything. Tituba was an enslaved woman in the household of Reverend Samuel Parris, generally described in historical sources as coming from Barbados, though her exact origins are uncertain and have been the subject of significant scholarly revision. When accused of witchcraft, Tituba did something that no other defendant in the first wave of accusations did. She confessed, elaborately. She described the devil, his book, his other witches, their meetings. Her confession was rich with the exact details that the Puritan theological framework had primed the court to expect. Her confession immediately validated the entire enterprise. If one accused witch was confessing to meeting the devil, then the others who denied it must be lying. Tituba's confession did not save her from imprisonment. but it created the evidentiary template that every subsequent confession would follow. She spent months in prison and was eventually sold to pay her jail fees. Fact 10. The examinations were held in the church, the holiest space in the community. The preliminary examinations of the accused, before formal trial, were conducted in the Salem Village Meeting House, which was simultaneously the community's church and its primary public gathering space. This was not incidental. It placed the full weight of religious authority behind the proceedings. The afflicted girls performed their convulsions and accusations in a sacred space before their entire community, with the minister presiding. The theatrical effectiveness of this setting is hard to overstate. The community was watching the devil attack the innocent in God's own house. The response this demanded, righteous, total, uncompromising, was shaped by the space in which it was demanded. Now we move into the mechanics of the trials themselves, and this is where the facts become genuinely difficult to process, because the legal procedures of Salem 1692 were not primitive improvisation. They were the product of a sophisticated theological and legal tradition being applied, catastrophically, without adequate safeguards. The results were predictable in retrospect and invisible in the moment. Let's go fact by fact through the machine. Fact 11. Of the 19 people executed, not one was convicted on physical evidence alone. Every single conviction at Salem rested substantially on spectral evidence. The testimony of afflicted persons that the specter, or spiritual double, of the accused had appeared to them and caused them harm. There was no murder weapon, no contract with the devil, no physical evidence of any kind that would be recognizable as evidence in any modern court. The accused were convicted because people testified that invisible versions of them had done invisible things. The court accepted this testimony because the prevailing theological consensus held that God would not permit the devil to use the shape of an innocent person. When this theological premise was later challenged, when Increase Mather published his argument that the devil could indeed use innocent shapes, the entire evidentiary basis of every conviction collapsed simultaneously. Fact 12. Confessing to witchcraft was the only reliable survival strategy, and everyone who confessed survived. This is perhaps the most legally surreal fact about the Salem trials. Of the approximately 55 people who confessed to being witches, not one was executed. Every single person executed, all 19, was executed for refusing to confess, for insisting on their innocence. The survival logic was brutal and clear. Lie and live. Tell the truth and die. The court explicitly offered leniency to confessors who named additional witches, creating a mechanism in which the only way to reduce your own legal jeopardy was to increase someone else's. The confessions were not credible as evidence of guilt. They were the product of a system that made confession the rational choice, regardless of actual guilt. The court knew this and proceeded anyway. Fact 13. The accused were charged with crimes committed in their sleep, and couldn't use that as a defense. The spectral evidence framework created a specific legal absurdity that the court never adequately resolved. The accused were held responsible for what their specters did, but specters operated independently of the person's conscious will. An accused person might be in bed, asleep, witnessed by their household, at the exact time their specter was supposedly tormenting people across the village. This alibi, "I was asleep, I was here, I couldn't have been there," was useless as a defense because nobody was accusing their physical bodies of being somewhere. The spectral double operated independently. You could not control it, but you were responsible for what it did. The logic would be familiar to anyone who has studied the history of laws that hold people responsible for acts they had no ability to prevent. Fact 14. The touch test was used as evidence, and it was a self-fulfilling performance. One of the primary diagnostic tests for witchcraft employed during the Salem crisis was the touch test. If a witch touched an afflicted person during a convulsion, the convulsion would stop, because the witch was withdrawing the tormenting specter back into herself. This sounds like it could at least be observed objectively. Either the convulsion stops, or it doesn't. But the administration of the test in Salem courtrooms made objectivity impossible. The afflicted were in a state of high emotional arousal, performing before a packed audience that expected a specific result. When the accused was brought forward and touched the afflicted stopped convulsing. This was treated as confirmation of guilt. The possibility that the cessation of convulsion was a response to the dramatic social moment, to being touched by the accused person while everyone watched, was not seriously considered. The test confirmed whatever the court already believed. Fact 15. Dogs were executed as witch familiars, and their executions are in the official record. At least 2 dogs were executed during the Salem crisis as suspected witch familiars. This is documented in the official records of the period. The executions of animals as participants in witchcraft was not unusual in the broader history of European witch hunting. Animals had been tried and executed in various European jurisdictions for centuries, a practice rooted in the belief that the devil used animals as vessels. What makes the Salem dog executions notable is that they occurred alongside the executions of human beings, in a legal framework that was being operated by educated, Harvard-trained ministers and magistrates who were simultaneously writing sophisticated theological treatises about evidence standards. The dogs and the people were treated by the same legal and theological machinery. Fact 16. The afflicted could identify witches in total darkness, which nobody found strange at the time. During several examinations, the afflicted accusers demonstrated their ability to identify their tormentors in darkness or blindfolded, claiming that their supernatural suffering allowed them to sense the presence of the witch without visual cues. These demonstrations were accepted as further evidence of the supernatural nature of the afflictions. What is remarkable in retrospect is not that the demonstrations were performed, but that they were accepted. That a court, applying what it believed to be rigorous legal standards, treated a blindfolded person's ability to name the accused as probative evidence. The standard of evidence that the Salem court applied was shaped entirely by the theological framework in which it operated. Within that framework, supernatural identification was more reliable than ordinary observation, because it came from a supernatural source. Fact 17. The speed of the trials was itself a form of injustice. Some lasted less than an hour. The court of Oyer and Terminer moved through its cases with a speed that, combined with the predetermined nature of the evidentiary standards, made the proceedings more theatrical than judicial. Some examinations lasted less than an hour. The accused were not represented by counsel in the modern sense. The adversarial legal system with professional defense attorneys did not exist in this form in 17th century Massachusetts. The accused spoke for themselves, were questioned by judges who had already reached conclusions, and were surrounded by afflicted accusers who performed their torment in real time during the proceedings. The pace was driven partly by the sheer volume of accusations. There were simply too many accused to try slowly, and partly by the court's certainty that speed was justified because the evidence was overwhelming. It was not. Fact 18. Accusers who recanted faced the same accusations they had made. The system had no exit. One of the most chilling features of the Salem accusation system was its treatment of those who attempted to withdraw their accusations or express doubt about the proceedings. When individuals tried to recant testimony or publicly question the validity of the trials, they found themselves quickly vulnerable to accusations of witchcraft themselves. The implicit message was clear. Skepticism about the witch hunt was itself suspicious, because only someone in league with the devil would want to protect the devil's servants. This created a closed logical system with no legitimate exit. Belief confirmed the hunt. Disbelief confirmed guilt. The Salem crisis was, in this structural sense, unfalsifiable from the inside. Fact 19. The court received petitions from all over Massachusetts and ignored almost all of them. As the trials proceeded through the summer of 1692, petitions defending the accused began arriving at the court from communities across Massachusetts. Neighbors testified to the good character of the accused. Community members vouched for specific individuals. Families presented evidence of impossible alibi. The court's response to this flood of counter-testimony was to largely ignore it. Character witnesses were sometimes told that the devil could use good people as readily as bad. Alibi testimony was irrelevant because it addressed the physical person, not the specter. The legal framework had been constructed in a way that made exculpatory evidence structurally inadmissible, not because the judges were evil, but because the theological premises of the prosecution made defense evidence logically irrelevant within that framework. Fact 20. The economic damage to families of the accused was devastating and long-lasting. When someone was formally accused of witchcraft in Massachusetts in 1692, the immediate consequences extended far beyond their personal legal jeopardy. The accused were arrested and imprisoned, and in 17th-century Massachusetts, prisoners paid for their own imprisonment. Jail fees, food costs, and the fees of the court officials were charged to the prisoner and their family. Property could be seized. Businesses collapsed without their operators. Farms went unworked during the critical growing season. Animals died unattended. The economic impact of an accusation could destroy a family financially, even if the accused was ultimately acquitted. Several families lost essentially everything to the legal costs of defending against witchcraft charges. The reparations authorized by the Massachusetts legislature in 1711, 19 years later, were a fraction of the actual losses. The end of the Salem crisis is, in many ways, stranger than its beginning. The way it stopped, the way it was remembered, the way it was officially acknowledged, the scientific theories that came later, the legal echoes that stretched 3 centuries forward. All of it contains facts that are as difficult to process as anything that happened in the courtroom. Let's go through them. Fact 21. The crisis stopped, not because anyone proved innocence, but because the accusations became too powerful. The Salem witch hunt stopped, primarily, because the accusations began reaching people who had the social and political power to make them stop. By the summer of 1692, accusers were naming the wife of Governor Phipps. They were threatening former Governor Simon Bradstreet. They were circling around Increase Mather and the Boston merchant elite. The expansion of the accusations into the upper echelons of colonial society created a political problem that the theological problem had never created. The powerful had reasons to act that the powerless could not generate. The shift in the court's posture, the growing official skepticism about spectral evidence, the dissolution of the Court of Oyer and Terminer in October 1692, followed the pattern of the accusations reaching untouchable targets. Had the accusations remained confined to the marginal and the poor, they might have continued indefinitely. Fact 22. One judge publicly apologized, the others went silent or doubled down. Samuel Sewall was the only judge of the Court of Oyer and Terminer who made a public, personal apology for his role in the Salem executions. On January 14, 1697, a Massachusetts day of fasting called to acknowledge the court's errors. Sewall stood in the Old South Church in Boston while his minister read aloud a written statement in which Sewall acknowledged his guilt, asked pardon of God and the victims' families, and accepted personal responsibility for the deaths. He remained standing throughout the reading, bearing the public weight of the acknowledgement. William Stoughton, the chief judge, the architect of the court's evidentiary standards, the man most directly responsible for the executions, never apologized, never expressed doubt, and continued to hold public office in Massachusetts until his death in 1701. Fact 23. The last Salem prisoner was not released until 14 months after the executions ended. The executions at Gallows Hill ended in September 1692 when Governor Phipps halted the proceedings. But the prisoners who had been charged and not yet tried, or who had been convicted but not yet executed, remained in jail. Some had confessed and named others, and were awaiting the resolution of those additional cases. Some were too sick to be moved. Some could not pay their jail fees, and had no family with the resources to secure their release. The last prisoners from the Salem crisis were not released until May 1693, 14 months after the crisis began. At least 5 people died in prison during this period, including an infant born to an imprisoned mother. Fact 24. The formal legal exoneration of the last Salem victims took 309 years. The Massachusetts legislature passed legislation reversing the attainders of 6 of the Salem executed in 1711, 19 years after the trials. But this legislation did not cover all the victims. Subsequent legislative actions in 1957 and 2001 added more names to the official exoneration. The last group of Salem victims, 5 individuals whose names had been omitted from every previous exoneration, were officially cleared by the Massachusetts legislature in November 2001, 309 years after their executions. The resolution came through the advocacy of a high school student in Danvers, formerly Salem Village, who had researched the gap in the official record. The state formally acknowledged that these individuals had been wrongfully convicted. It took 3 centuries. Fact 25. Arthur Miller invented the most famous scene in Salem history, and millions believe it actually happened. Arthur Miller's 1953 play, The Crucible, is, for most people worldwide, the primary source of their knowledge about the Salem Witch Trials. The play contains a scene, perhaps the most dramatically powerful in the play, in which Abigail Williams and the other afflicted girls see a yellow bird in the rafters of the courtroom and perform their accusation of Mary Warren in a way that directly echoes their accusation of the innocent. This scene did not happen. It is Miller's dramatic invention. More broadly, Miller compressed the timeline, aged up the teenage accusers, invented a romantic relationship between Abigail Williams and John Proctor that has no historical basis, and altered the characters and motivations of dozens of historical figures. The Crucible is a great play and a powerful allegory, but it is not history, and the widespread belief that it is history has substantially distorted public understanding of what actually happened in 1692. Fact 26. The afflictions displayed a specific, documentable pattern of social contagion. When researchers mapped the spread of affliction symptoms through the Salem Village community in 1692, the pattern that emerged was not consistent with any known disease transmission mechanism, but was highly consistent with social contagion. Symptoms spread primarily along social networks. The girls who developed afflictions first were the ones who knew each other best, who spent the most time together, who shared the most social context. The symptoms spread from this core outward along lines of acquaintance and proximity. Girls on the periphery of the social group developed symptoms later and less severely. Girls in entirely separate communities developed symptoms only after exposure to the Salem accusers. This pattern is the signature of mass psychogenic illness, not of ergot contamination or encephalitis epidemic, both of which would produce geographically distributed rather than socially distributed symptom patterns. Fact 27. The theological debate about spectral evidence had been running for decades before Salem, and Salem settled it. The question of whether spectral evidence was reliable, whether God would permit the devil to use an innocent person's shape to harm others, was not invented in 1692. It had been an active debate in English and New England theology for decades. The position that spectral evidence alone was insufficient for conviction had been argued by respected English theologians, including Richard Baxter, whose works were in the libraries of Massachusetts ministers. The Salem crisis did not occur because nobody had thought of the epistemological problem with spectral evidence. It occurred because, at the moment of crisis, the ministers and magistrates of Massachusetts chose the more dangerous theological position, that God's providence prevented innocent specters over the safer one. Salem settled the debate permanently in favor of the safer position. No Massachusetts court ever again accepted spectral evidence as sufficient for conviction. Fact 28. The anniversary of the executions was marked by silence for decades, then became a tourist industry. For most of the 18th and 19th centuries, the Salem Witch Trials were a source of shame rather than spectacle for the communities involved. Salem Town, which is modern Salem, Massachusetts, spent much of its history trying to emphasize other aspects of its identity. Its maritime heritage, its China trade, its federal period architecture. The witch trials were acknowledged, but not celebrated. The transformation of Salem into a tourism destination built around the witch trials is largely a 20th century phenomenon, accelerating dramatically after the success of the Crucible brought renewed national attention to 1692. Modern Salem receives approximately 1 million visitors per year, the majority of them in October. The gift shops, museums, and attractions now generate more annual revenue than the entire colonial economy of the region produced in a decade. Fact 29. The scientific investigation of the Salem afflictions is still ongoing and still unresolved. Linda Caporael's ergot hypothesis, published in Science magazine in 1976, launched the modern scientific investigation of the Salem afflictions and remains the most widely known alternative explanation. But the scientific response to her hypothesis was not acceptance. It was a sustained methodological critique that identified serious problems with the geographic and temporal distribution of symptoms as evidence for ergot contamination. Subsequent proposals, the encephalitis hypothesis, the Lyme disease hypothesis, the toxic mold hypothesis, have each found some supporters and many critics. The consensus position among the historians and scientists who study Salem most carefully is that no single biological explanation adequately accounts for all the features of the crisis. Mass psychogenic illness, operating in a community under extreme stress within a specific theological framework, remains the most parsimonious explanation, though it is not one that lends itself to the clean certainty that a single biological cause would provide. Fact 30. The Salem crisis produced, as a direct response, the legal principle that changed American justice forever. The most lasting institutional consequence of the Salem witch trials was a fundamental shift in American legal epistemology, in the standards of evidence required before the state could take a person's life. The specific principle that emerged from the Salem critique was the requirement for material, verifiable, observable evidence as the foundation of criminal prosecution. The arguments made by Thomas Brattle, Increase Mather, and the other critics of the Salem court were, at their core, arguments about what counts as proof, about the distinction between sincere belief and demonstrable fact. These arguments fed directly into the developing Anglo-American legal tradition's increasing emphasis on evidentiary standards and procedural safeguards. The constitutional protections against arbitrary detention, the rights of the accused, the exclusionary rules that govern what evidence courts may consider. None of these emerged fully formed from Salem, but Salem provided one of the most powerful object lessons in American experience, of what happens when these safeguards are absent. 30 facts. 30 specific, documented, verifiable facts about what happened in Salem in 1692. And yet the cumulative effect of reading them is not the satisfaction of understanding something that was previously mysterious. It is something closer to the opposite. The growing realization that the mystery was never really about the devil, or about witchcraft, or about Puritan superstition. The mystery was always about the mechanisms by which ordinary human communities, under ordinary human stress, produce extraordinary human catastrophes. The machinery of Salem, the legal framework that made confession the only safe choice, the theological framework that made spectral evidence admissible, the social framework that made accusation follow the lines of pre-existing conflict, the political framework that made institutional corrections slow and dangerous. None of this was alien to human experience. All of it is recognizable. All of it has been rebuilt in different materials, in different centuries, in different countries, for different reasons, targeting different groups. What makes Salem worth returning to, what makes these facts worth knowing in detail, is not the spectacle of a different world doing terrible things in the name of a theology we no longer hold. It is the recognition that the structural conditions that produced Salem are not confined to Salem. They are conditions that human societies recreate with terrible regularity whenever the combination of real stress, available scapegoats, inadequate epistemology, and insufficient institutional safeguards comes together in the same place at the same time. The spectral evidence of 1692 is gone. Its successors are not. Every generation produces its own version of the unfalsifiable accusation, the confession that protects the confessor only if they name others, the courtroom performance that substitutes theatrical certainty for demonstrable proof. The names change, the costumes change, the accused change. The machinery does not. Salem ended. It ended because the accusations reached the powerful, because a few brave critics refused to be silenced, because institutional inertia eventually gave way to the weight of accumulated injustice. It did not end because human nature changed. It did not end because the conditions that produce it were eliminated. It ended, as it always ends, just late enough to be remembered. The question is always the same. How late is too late?